Hi again, welcome back to Friday Live. I'm Cara Barrett, editor at Hodinkee, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Eric Wendt, senior watch specialist at Christie's, and an old friend of Hodinkee and former contributor. So welcome.
Thank you for having me, Cara. It's a pleasure.
It's
a dream come true, and hi, Mom. So thank you.
So today we're going to talk about watches and icons, and earlier this week I published a story on Jackie O's watch that's coming up for sale at the Christie's auction on the 21st, and today we have it in the office. So let's talk about it a little bit. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so the watch is manufactured circa 1962. It's a very exciting watch. Of course, when I got the email that the owner may be interested in selling it earlier this year, I couldn't believe it, my eyes. You know, that's a moment of elation, which is very exciting. The watch is preserved in very original condition with the original dial, which is amazing. She wore it throughout her life from when she got it in 1963 until she passed. Interestingly enough, you know, it was not part of the famous Jackie Kennedy auction at Sotheby's in 1995. No one really knew where it went all this time. So we presumed it was still within the family. And the watch is very interesting because it's one of the most iconic Cartier watches ever. I think that doing rough math, it probably has led to over $1 billion of sales for Cartier, particularly among women's watches.
Yeah.
And particularly in New York, when you walk around, every woman is wearing a tank just about on Wall Street and other places.
Yeah, it's a popular model for sure. It actually was my first watch when I was 18. I got the steel tank.
That's awesome.
With the bracelet. It was unfortunately stolen from me.
No.
Alas, but we move on.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, I agree. It's one of the most iconic watches that Cartier's ever produced and still produces. It's actually the 100th anniversary this year of the Cartier tank.
Yeah,
so
it's amazing.
Did you guys know? Did you hear about this last year and then plan it with the 100th anniversary?
No, we heard it earlier a few months ago.
Interesting.
And
super cool.
Yeah, and then the amazing thing is also the occasion. It was given to her by her brother-in-law, and it includes a painting that she gave her brother-in-law.
Right. Yeah, the painting's really sweet.
Really beautiful. Yeah.
You can see a picture of it on the article if you want to take a look at it.
Yeah.
I actually, when I saw it, I was like, "Oh, this would look great in my kitchen."
Yes. Yeah.
It's just like such a nice little artifact that accompanies the
and
watch.
Funny tidbit about that. Of course, we got a lot of press when we announced this in Town and Country and other publications. Of course, Hodinkee was the first to go live with the story. But one Irish newspaper published that a Jackie Kennedy painting is coming to auction and wrote a whole article about that.
Amazing.
And then at the end they said, oh, and it also includes a Cartier watch. Yeah. Usually the story was reversed, so that was pretty funny. So we're excited about it.
Yeah, and I feel like there's so many iconic watches that are coming up for sale. We have the Paul Newman.
Yeah.
Talked about it to death.
Yeah.
Still really excited about it. And then I feel you have a couple other watches here with you today that belong to icons or were inspired by icons.
Exactly.
So if you want to.
One of the fun things about working in an auction house is that you can, as you get property, begin to think about thematic auctions or thematic sections. So we ended up getting a couple interesting pieces from different American icons, and then I created this idea of giving that as the subtitle of the auction, and then we were able to go out and source more property from collectors. And so, we have I'm a big fan of presidential watches.
Yeah.
Actually, Christie's has never sold a presidential owned and worn watch before, and many other auction houses have. So that was something I've been focused on since I joined Christie's, since that's my bread and butter. So when the opportunity came to have
so we should probably start with that one.
Yeah, the LBJ Hamilton in two-tone. It was a gift from the McDowell County Democrats, and he wore it throughout the 1960 campaign as vice president to President Kennedy. It's an electric watch, which is amazing. It's running and was serviced.
It's incredible.
Many of these have service issues, so that's quite cool. You can see the way it sort of sweeps gradually, and was the predecessor to the quartz watch. The condition's beautiful. It's got an inscription on the back. That's very cool. And it's possible he wore that in the 1960 campaign because it was American, because it was sort of avant-garde, and he had Patek Philippe watches at that time, but this maybe connected more with voters, perhaps like Bill Clinton wearing the Timex Iron Man and other politicians of the last 30 years.
Elvis also had
He had the Ventura, which is very
it's
similar.
a similar
so
one.
I think this is the second most important Hamilton ever. The Ventura that Elvis wore, and Blue Crush is probably the most important.
Yeah. And what can you tell everyone the difference between an electric watch and a quartz watch is? Because I know there's sometimes I get a little confused, and so I feel like it might be good to.
I think the Accutron was the first electric, and they're battery powered, but the mechanism's very different. They're not nearly as accurate, and the reserves are far less than the quartz watches that followed with a Seiko Astron in 1969. But this was sort of the start of having a battery powered watch on the wrist.
Yeah, it's a super cool watch. And so there's also another LBJ watch that we have here, or LBJ related.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I first covered this in the Hodinkee Presidential Guide.
More on that in a little bit.
Yeah, and we sort of cataloged, interestingly enough, until that came out and I began talking to more people and researching it, a lot of people thought these were Masonic watches. There were some traced to LBJ, and I think that the case can certainly be made, and I think is made, that all of these were ordered by LBJ originally.
Yeah.
This was his favorite motto, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
The golden rule.
Exactly. So that watch, he ordered both 2552s, which is this sort of disco volante, as some people call it, case, and with a beautiful automatic movement, Patek Philippe's first, and the 2526 with enamel dial, and some had metal dials, which is also an automatic watch, the first reference from Patek to have an automatic movement.
And he also did this on another Hamilton as well.
Yes, and an electric Hamilton.
Do you know where that one is?
That was sold at auction at Heritage for something very cheap, under $1,000.
And is there only one, or are there multiple?
That's the only one known, and it has an LBJ on it. And
it only sold for $1,000?
It was under, it was like 800.
Oh boy.
And I really regret not buying that. That was just a couple of years ago. So yeah, these are incredibly cool watches, and the dials were likely placed on them in New York. I think at Tiffany, some of them say Tiffany and some of them don't. So maybe some were placed at a Texas retailer, but they were placed in the U.S. on the watches, and the Patek extracts generally say they don't have record of the style.
Right.
So it's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
I think they're really cool, unique watches.
And there are only 10
about 10 now
that have come up?
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. Across both references.
Yeah, I think, and this one was given to, this was his.
He gave it to
He gave it to someone, okay.
Yeah.
And then he used to wear it as well, or no?
He has two that are in the museum, both 2526s.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So he wore the 2526, and then this is the 2522. Okay.
2552.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Love the reference numbers.
But yeah, so that one's really great. And then I like this one a lot. The Cartier $20 coin watch.
Yeah, so this was made in 1926. In the catalog, we have a photo of the register showing it, this number being a coin watch in 1926. Yeah, so it's a 1908 $20 coin. It's quite worn, but this design was from Augustus St. Gaudens, and it's considered by many to be the most beautiful American coin ever made. It's very rare to find any coin watch from the 1920s.
Yeah, it's really early, because usually they had them in like the 50s,
30s,
60s.
40s, 50s, 60s, yeah. So only a few known of any brand in the 20s. This was like definitely very cutting edge and seen as very cool, because you can have this in your pocket and no one would know that it was actually a watch.
Right.
So that was sort of the appeal of this. And he supposedly, this was his personal piece for 11 years.
Okay.
And he gave it to legendary gangster Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy. We've been talking about Bumpy.
Yeah, in 1937.
Will wants to be called Bumpy from now on. That's what he told me earlier. So
good.
It's a new nickname in the office for everybody.
Yeah. So Bumpy owned this, and he also wore it. So the watch, the features are quite worn just because you're having it in your hand and having it in your pocket. He had it for many years and wore it, and of course proudly showed it as a trophy that the babe gave it to him. The exact relationship between the two of them isn't known, Maybe there was some gambling. Maybe there was some other stuff
he was a
going
troublemaker.
on.
I don't know much about Babe Ruth or sports for that matter, but I did read that he was a troublemaker.
He was.
So I feel like maybe that.
He lived the good life, and I think that
his best life.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting story. I wish we knew the exact specifics about how Bumpy knew Babe, but it's very, very cool.
Yeah, it's cool to see things like this come up in auction, and I think.
Yeah.
So much about collecting watches and buying watches and loving watches is the story behind them, and so when there's someone like Babe Ruth or LBJ kind of tied into them, it just really I don't know, like when the Cartier tank first came in, it was just like magic.
Yes.
And I don't know, it's something that you really can't duplicate. So and these are on display this weekend.
At Rockefeller Plaza, Christie's.
If you're in New York, you can
today through Tuesday.
You can hold Babe Ruth's coin watch.
Yeah, and coin watches generally, interestingly enough, I've seen a lot more interest in them the last 2 years from younger people that are getting into it, and collectors that just think they're very cool to have on their desk. Or you touch them and you can see it took so many hours to produce something like this and cut it apart so carefully. It's craftsmanship unlike anything we see today, basically.
And then other makers that made them, Piaget made them, and then
Patek Philippe. We see Rolex, a number of brands.
I don't think I've ever seen a Rolex one.
Yeah, we had one in Geneva, and there's a few out there.
Oh God, I'll have to take a look. That sounds exciting.
Yeah.
And then, so speaking of presidents, I don't know if you guys have read it yet, but you should, because Eric wrote a very long and in-depth article on presidents' watches. And so I kind of wanted, while you're here, I wanted to ask you what your favorite president's watch is.
It was around the time I was first getting into watches. I heard the story about, which is an international news story about Abraham Lincoln's pocket watch at the Smithsonian American History Museum in D.C., and that they were going to have this opening of the watch to examine the movement.
Right.
And
it was like a ceremony to open the watch.
And see what happened, because the watchmaker was working on it at the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, and it passed down in his family for 140 years that their ancestor had worked on Abraham Lincoln's watch and written something on the movement on the.
That's incredible.
And then Abraham Lincoln himself apparently didn't know that this engraving was on the watch.
So he dropped it off for service.
Yes, and then the Civil War broke out.
The guy wrote an inscription, put it back together, and then gave it back to Lincoln.
And the president never knew. I would be kind of pissed if watchmakers were writing stuff on my movements.
Are you going to open up all your watches?
Exactly.
Have you written anything secret?
Hopefully not. And so they had this big ceremony, all kinds of press there, and they opened it up, and the message is there, and it was like so formal and staged. It was funny to see the watchmaker looking at the loop.
So
and
cool.
The whole deal was amazing.
Yeah.
So that was sort of when I was first getting interested in watches, and why I've always had this interest in presidential watches.
Yeah. And for me, what I was rereading the article, and I guess I'd never been so struck, but I think LBJ has the best taste in watches, and I didn't realize that he really focused on the craft of collecting, and he really enjoyed watches.
He did. And
there's a cool story about the
Vulcain cricket, which he loved. He liked alarm watches a lot, it seemed, and he loved gifts, so hence why we see this reference. 2552. He loved to give very extravagant gifts to friends and fellow members of the Senate.
So it was good to be pals with LBJ.
Yeah. So he had his staff go out when they were in Geneva and buy every single Vulcain cricket they could get their hands on, so he could give them as gifts. And there's at least one in the National Watch and Clock Museum that has the LBJ on it, on the dial.
Very cool. And is that where? So I know Obama was gifted a Vulcan.
Yeah. So
is that where that kind of tradition came from?
Yeah, the first was Truman got one from the White House press photographers, a press corps, and they then Eisenhower had one that apparently the alarm went off during a meeting about tariffs on Swiss watches to protect the American watchmaking industry. So it was very ironic that a Swiss watch was ringing, and he looked a little foolish at the time, and then. Every president except President Bush has been given one, by particularly this gentleman in Finland who's a watch retailer. Has been giving them. So it's an individual that gives them. Yeah, it's not the company. The company and the individual separately, or in conjunction in a few cases. Very cool. Yeah, it's amazing. Well, that's a great. I love that story. But so I think we'll move on to what's on our wrists next. Sure. Yeah.
politics aside, we'll move on from that. But yeah, what are you wearing today?
I am wearing an early 1940s Hoyer on a gay frere bracelet. Got it on eBay, of all places. But I'm wearing...
an eBay find.
Yeah, and very scratched up crystal. It's an amazing watch. We have a group of over 30 Hoyer chronographs in our auction on Wednesday.
Oh, okay, great. So
a lot of Hoyer collectors are coming from around the country.
They're having a moment, I would say.
Yeah, so I've got to wear a Hoyer to represent my people.
Oh, of course, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
And I'm wearing my Daytona, the Cerachrome bezel that I got last year after Basel, my first Basel. So it's a great summer watch. I just love wearing it. You can beat it around. I mean, it's over a year old and it's barely...
It looks great.
Looks brand new.
Yeah.
So I'm really into it, and I do get a lot of messages about why I chose the black or if I prefer the white.
Yeah.
I chose the black. It just suited my, truth be told, my outfits more.
Yeah.
As shallow as that sounds,
Yes.
but that was just kind of it for me. So,
That's great.
but I do like the white as well.
Yeah.
Either one. So I think we're going to move on to questions. And we had some questions that were submitted last week, and so we're going to go back and revisit those. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, sounds good. So someone asked, A White 12, why, if we prefer buying vintage or buying modern, and what our opinions are on that, and how you decide. And so, since you are, a vintage expert, I mean, what are your thoughts on vintage versus modern?
I like the stories behind vintage watches, the way they were made without computers. You can tell just the hand craftsmanship that was required in making the cases and the movements and the dials. I, of course, love new watches, certainly ones that have a lot of vintage inspiration, classic inspiration. And I mean, with most new watches, it's sort of like going and buying a new car where there'll be depreciation.
Yeah.
So we always tell people to be sensitive about that, because if you're going in and buying a new BMW M3 in 5 years, it's going to be worth a lot less. And people come to us with these big collections, sometimes multi-million-dollar collections. I'm sure you saw the same at Sotheby's, and they think that these things will be worth 90% of what they paid, and it's a fraction. That was always a bummer. It is, yeah. So that's a hard part of the job. But vintage watches, of course, if you buy them right, they're generally worth close to what you paid.
Right.
And hopefully, as more people get into them, we've seen obviously rapid increases in price. What modern watch what did you like from the releases this year the most that was modern? Like, what was your favorite? I like the Autavia, although it's a little bit thick for me, and I would prefer it without date. Okay. But I like that watch, and I like they did the bracelet very well executed. I thought that's to me one of the most amazing things. That was my favorite thing about it. I love it. And what about you? My favorite. Gosh, now I'm drawing a blank. What did I like? I liked I was just going to say the Yachtmaster from Rolex with all those multicolored stones, but I know that everybody hates that watch. It's amazing. I think that watch is going to be worth a lot of money. The thing about that watch is it's so crazy, but when you understand the craftsmanship that goes behind getting all those stones together, it's really just... I don't know. And you have to respect the rainbow watches, both white gold and yellow gold, from the white gold rainbow Daytona and the yellow gold. Those are watches that are worth so much more than they were originally. I also like the pink gold Daytona that they came out with the Cerachrome bezel, but I want it on a bracelet. Because I feel like that's kind of how it looks. But so, and then the next question was, Son of Alonga is... I love that username, by the way. I hope you can help me out on this one. I want to buy a watch for under $2K. I'm thinking of a Nomos Tangenta or a Club. However, I'd like to know if there's some great iconic vintage pieces that one can get for under $2K. Yeah, so on the vintage front, I feel like Vulcane crickets are they can be $600 to $1,000 on eBay or less. They're really great movements, very reliable, very well made, and sort of they're worth the same amount that they were when I started buying them 7 years ago. They haven't moved very much. And then also Omega Seamasters from the 60s. They're 35 millimeters or around there. They've got these nice straight lugs. It's like Don Draper and Mad Men wore one with a black dial, just that sort of case. And very easy watches to wear that look great. And obviously a great brand name, very good movements. They're like $500 to $1,000 in that range.
I like the Wittnauer chronographs with the Valjoux 72 movements. I think those are just really well designed, and the movement is, it's the same as a Daytona, so you kind of get a lot of bang for your buck. And then as far as the modern, I think your suggestion of the club is a great option. For me, I loved the pink one that came out this year. But then...
And then the Max Bill watches from Young'uns, I think are great for what they're. I've got 2 vintage models. They're basically the same except a little bigger. The new ones, you can get the same original size too, and they're around $1,000. I've recommended them to a lot of friends over the last few years who are looking for something in that range that they can wear, and they've been all thrilled with them.
Yeah. Oh, great. Good to know. So now we're going to move to some live questions that are going on. And hold on one second. Just gonna see. Oh, Ricardo Reese wants to know, one presidential watch I found super interesting was Winston Churchill's La Mania chronograph. What's the story there?
Well, he wasn't a president, but we can talk about it.
True. Prime Minister.
That was an amazing watch. It's one of those watches like a lot of provenance watches where the provenance is over 90% of the value.
Right.
And it sold at Sotheby's London for almost $200,000.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
A few months ago. Amazing watch. I'm not sure if he actually wore it, but it was mint condition and it was a gift to him. So very cool watch.
Amazing. And then next.
Winston Churchill had a Rolex that he wore frequently, which Rolex gave to him. It was, I think, the 500,000th chronometer they made, and it was in gold. And he also had a Breguet pocket watch he wore frequently. Both are on display in London.
Yeah.
And very cool to see.
Awesome. A cool, smart person asked, what's it like working for someone as awesome as Ben? I think Ben may have just submitted that question. It's terrible. He's the worst. Just kidding. He's awesome. Just don't be mad. He's crazy.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we've seen a lot of association watches garnering attention recently. Jackie Kennedy, Paul Newman, Babe Ruth. I wonder if Eric foresees this trend extending to less exalted or less monumental figures in history. Where do you draw the line? Nancy Reagan, Burt Reynolds, Jose Canseco.
Yeah, I think. I think all provenance is sort of interesting around watches, but there was a lot of excitement with Bernie Madoff and his watch collection a few years back. I remember that's all everyone could talk about, is buying his watches from the government auction. And people were paying ridiculous figures for refinished dial, Rolex chronograph, vintage, and all these other pieces. They were spending over $30,000, and the watch is worth like $10,000.
That's so crazy, because for me, like when someone, there's a negative connotation with the person, I feel like that would almost, it would
hurt.
Yes, it would hurt the value of the watch. But I guess
I think those people have, most of the watches I remember looking at the time of the auction, thinking, what sort of junk. And people were irrationally exuberant, thinking it would be some important historical figure. And I think they've lost money.
I was going to say, they'll come back up, and I'm sure they're not going to make.
I think most of them lost money on that.
What do you do in a situation like that? So you get a watch and the provenance isn't ideal, but it's someone iconic.
Yeah.
It's like in a negative connotation. Do you convince the seller to not mention it?
It's really, it's just case by case.
Yeah.
We, of course, generally stay away from Nazi watches, and that's important.
A general rule.
And I can't think of any other cases beyond that.
That's the hard. That's the one hard rule.
Yeah.
Okay, so Eric, curious to hear your perspective on the significant delta between vintage UG and Heuer, for example. Lesser-known brands with similar cases and identical movements, such as Galley, Wittnauer, Zodiac, et al. And what do you think the market may look like in the future?
I think certainly Ben, a lot of people attribute Ben to the rise in Universal Genève interest over the last 7 years. And he's got an amazing collection of those.
Yeah.
Heuer we've seen absolutely skyrocket the last 2.5 years. And I think part of it was initially people that were looking for other brands, but when they couldn't afford vintage Rolex Daytonas and things like that. Part of it is definitely the amount of information that's out there, because it's not like really we have Jeff Stein to thank of on the dash. I said if we go back in history like Terminator style and kill Jeff Stein, I think Hoyer collecting would be so different. Hoyers would be like worse than Galets, maybe, I don't know. I mean, they're amazing watches, but people might not, it'd be like any car is what I compare it to. There's no site that really explains all about any car watches in the same way.
Yeah.
But if there was, and I think people are working on it. I mean, Aquastar, for instance, were great watches, and there was just the first ever Aquastar get-together in Geneva before the auction. And now we're seeing these prices go sometimes 5x what they were a year ago, 2 years ago. So it's really driven by collectors, driven by knowledge and other people thinking it's cool. More and more people are getting on the Galet bandwagon.
Yeah, I love Galets.
I love them. I have one. I've owned a few. And I think they're really undervalued compared to other brands.
So the next big thing?
Galet.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Cara.
And thank you all for joining us. And as always, if you leave your questions below, we'll try to answer them next week. And that's us signing off.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.